Well, thanks for the introduction. As she said, I co-chair the Sierra Club's Borderlands team. The Borderlands team is sort of within the larger Sierra Club. There are regional groups, and then there are teams that deal with issues, and the Borderlands team deals with the issues that surround the environmental impacts that have to do with border security. So the border walls, roads, all that kind of stuff that does damage to very fragile ecosystems from the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico. I'm also an assistant professor of visual arts at South Texas College. I've got one thing in the show, which is the big photo in the other room. And actually I've got a couple that are up here too that were part of the Border Studies Archive because, as she was saying, the Border Studies Archive, which is from the University of Texas at Rio Grande Valley, the two co-curators of the show are there, and actually that's one of them in the corner. That's Miguel right there from a couple of years ago. And of course, what I want to talk about is the border wall. And the border wall, or the border walls that currently stand, are 700 miles in scattered pieces, some long, some short, along the 1,900-mile U.S.-Mexico border. And there are a whole host of different designs. You can see some of those in some of the pictures on the walls. And those walls that stand have inflicted a number of different types of environmental damage. We're going to see a video in a second that talks primarily about habitat fragmentation and impacts on wildlife. Wildlife is blocked from passage the same way that people are supposed to be, although wildlife isn't as good at building ladders as people are. They also do a lot of damage in terms of erosion. You get water that's blocked, where channels are crossed by border walls. And for those impacts to occur, the federal government has waived or set aside basically every environmental law on the books because these walls would have violated many of them. And so I think kind of as a starting point, I want to show a very brief video. It's about 7 minutes long. And one of the people that's in the video, which is actually that one of the people, is Krista Schleier. She is a member of the Borderlands team. She's also an author and a photographer. And so I'll kind of let them speak for themselves for a second, or for 7 minutes worth of seconds, and then I'll pick back up.
I'd been in the borderlands for 15 years before the first wall went up, and since then there have been dramatic changes that have really just been heartbreaking for people who knew the borderlands. Our boundaries are everywhere, and we don't really think about what they do to all of the other creatures that share this planet with us.
It's just a little spoonful of dirt, but it never seems to separate.
When people see my images, the reaction almost every time has been just, I didn't have any idea that this place was so beautiful or that these creatures live there. And surprisingly, many, many people had no idea we were building a border wall on our southern border.
I think people create boundaries because it helps us deal with what otherwise we would perceive as chaos, either at a small scale like our own backyard or at a large scale at national boundaries.
I think some of the barriers that we create out of fear. The Department of Homeland Security started building the border wall in 2007, and the mandate was for 700 miles of border wall along a 2,000-mile border. The Real ID Act allowed the Department of Homeland Security to waive all laws in order to expedite building of a border wall. And that includes the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Wilderness Act. all of these laws that are essentially meant to protect us from ourselves.
And what we realized as ecologists is that there's been a lot of talk about security and border fence issues, but nobody really had any data on some of the key species down there. What really makes the US-Mexico border region special is it's kind of a meeting location for both North America and Central and South America species. And so it has one of the highest biodiversity levels that we find anywhere in the US.
5 of North America's 6 cat species live in the borderlands, and 3 of those cats are endangered, the jaguar, the ocelot, and the jaguarundi. And really their main hope for being restored in the United States is to have open migration corridors with Mexico.
Any human-made structure out on the landscape has a high potential to impact wildlife, particularly migratory species that need to move throughout the year to gain either access to food resources or water resources. One of the things we see with man-made boundaries such as the US-Mexico border is they can appear very quickly on the landscape. There's a tendency sometimes to say, well, the animals will just adjust and they'll adapt and move in a different way. But a lot of animals just haven't had the time to adapt and change with such a major change on the landscape.
I've seen wildlife trying to cross the border and not being able to. At one point, I saw a pair of javelina traveling along the border for about 100 yards, and they would go up to the wall and they would smell it, and then they would continue walking, and then go up to it and smell it, continue walking, and eventually they turned away. And that, of course, is a problem for those javelina, but it's also a problem from an ecological standpoint because javelina are seed distributors. If they can't move north, then neither can the plants whose seeds they distribute. So a whole ecosystem disruption can come from this barrier.
I think early on in the discussion of the border wall along the US-Mexico border, there was an acknowledgement that there was going to be impacts to wildlife. As an ecologist, the first thing that jumps in my mind is there's got to be some way we can mitigate this. We are now starting to generate data as the conservation community of the potential impacts of the wall on movement of wildlife. And our hope as conservationists is that the people that are on the ground and the decision makers will take that information and make adjustments. One of the really good pieces of advice that I got early on in my career was in order to think like a scientist and to be a good scientist, we need to put ourselves in the place of the animals. And by that I mean, really going out there and thinking like that animal would on the landscape. And so that kind of approach transcends just the science of being a wildlife ecologist. It always helps to take a different perspective than your own.
Probably there will always be boundaries that humans impose on the rest of the world. But the question is, do we do it thoughtfully, consciously, and find ways to minimize the damage that we do? Or do we do it without thought and create all sorts of unintended consequences? I have a lot of hope that we're going to get to a place where we understand the impacts that we've had on the land and on wild species and try to come back into balance, and I think we'll get there.
So, I think one of the key things that always strikes me with the whole border wall enterprise, and I've been working on this, since 2006, before the walls actually went up, is that essentially what we're dealing with are these abstractions that have been imposed upon real places. You know, somebody has this line on a map and they want that line to be manifested in the real world. And the wall is a way to manifest it. It's a way to make it real. The problem then comes about from all the complexity that's in the real world, the chaos that John talks about in the video. And when you impose this artificial line in this very complex and, you know, to some minds chaotic landscape and ecosystem and interaction between, you know, the wildlife and the landscape, you cause tremendous amounts of damage. You know, the further problem is sort of the fear that Krista talks about. It's based upon this fear of, you know, all that could come across or all that could pass through that area, and so nothing else matters at that point. You know, the fact that this damage is done to the environment, to communities, it's deemed to be irrelevant by the people who are building the walls. Now, this picture is of what is kind of considered the gold standard for wall building. You see farther back, so right along here, the old border wall, the walls that were built in the mid to late 1990s. These walls were made out of scrap steel, basically landing mats that were kind of corrugated steel panels that in the Vietnam War would be tossed down over an irregular piece of the land so that a helicopter would have a flat surface to land upon. They were welded together. They stood about 10 feet high, and according to the Border Patrol, they were an absolute failure, and they did nothing. People could cut through them or jump over them without any difficulty. So then in the mid to late 2000s, you get what's called the triple fence design, which is you keep the old wall up, you build this new wall, which is kind of in the foreground of the picture. It's 18 feet, it slopes towards Mexico to make it a little more difficult to climb at the top. You clear out all of the land in between so that there's no cover for anybody. You put in patrol roads, you put in lights to banish the night. You basically eliminate that chaotic landscape, that chaotic ecosystem, and you create a militarized zone that exists solely for the purpose of you know, supposed border security. It still doesn't work, but that's the idea at least. The next slide. When those types of walls went up in California, you know, in the 1990s, San Diego, Tijuana, that was the biggest crossing point because you had two major cities, so you had people going from one to the other. Walls went up. They didn't really stop anybody, but they did reroute a lot of the traffic. So people would see this big wall, they'd especially see all of the Border Patrol enforcing it, and they would just kind of go to the end of it and go around it. And that's when you start to see a lot of people crossing in the Arizona desert. So following the Secure Fence Act of 2006, which mandated hundreds of miles of new walls, you start to see a lot of border walls going up in the Arizona desert. This one's in the Coronado National Memorial. The problem with that, or one of the problems with that, is that you then get impacts on endangered species and other terrestrial wildlife. You know, in this case, this is an area that federally endangered jaguar would need. Jaguar used to travel as far north as the Grand Canyon. They were thought to have been wiped out in the United States, but in 1996, one was photographed in the mountains in Arizona between Tucson and the US-Mexico border. Since then, you get shots like this by cameras that have been set up that are motion sensitive, and you know, probably a handful of jaguar have been photographed fairly regularly in the intervening years. The problem is it's only a handful, and there are more stable, larger populations in Mexico. The ones that are in the United States, if they're to endure, need to be able to get back and forth. They need more territory, but they particularly need mates, otherwise they'll basically die out. Next slide, please. You get the exact same problem in South Texas, where I live. This is the border wall in the Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge was established along the river for habitat protection for federally endangered ocelots. Ocelots are another wildcat. They're significantly smaller than a jaguar, probably less than half the size of a jaguar. There are believed to be around 50 of them left in the United States. There are more of them in Mexico. If they don't have access to mates in Mexico, you're going to have inbreeding, which imperils the population. You at the very least have reduced habitat, and that's what pushed them close to extinction in the first place. So these walls are already having impacts on endangered species. They do have a number of other environmental impacts as well. And kind of key to that is what you can see here, that nice straight line that goes diagonally from the lower right to the upper left. That's the border wall and the patrol road that runs alongside it. It cuts across all these drainages. It cuts across the Santa Cruz River, which is kind of the larger drainage in the picture. That originates in Mexico, flows across the border, passes through Tucson, and then eventually it gets into the Colorado River before coming back across the border again. And because you've got this mostly straight line running from El Paso to the Pacific Ocean that runs east-west, but most of your mountain ranges and drainages run north-south, that intersection, that impact, causes tremendous problems. It causes problems for the animals that would be following these drainages, but it causes problems for the drainages themselves. So this is what happens when you put a wall running east-west across a drainage that runs north-south. In many parts of areas of Arizona, you have washes that for most of the year don't have any water in them. So for somebody building a wall, it seems like, oh, we'll just stick the wall across that, it won't be a problem. And the Border Patrol guaranteed before construction happened that water would pass harmlessly through them. You can see this wall here is what they call their bollard style. Basically, you have 6-inch wide steel posts with 4-inch spaces between them. And so they said, hey, water's going to pass right through that, no problem. The problem with that idea is that when they do get water in them, it's typically going to be carrying a lot of debris. All of the accumulated brush that's made it into the water course gets picked up, floats along with it, and then that packs up against the wall, plugs the holes in between it. You then get sediment that also packs into it, and you get situations like this. The larger photograph was taken by the U.S. Bureau of Land Management in 2007. The one in the upper left I took, I'm not sure if it's the same area, but it's the same design, so I'm pretty sure that it's the same area. I don't know where the BLM photo was taken. But these would be in Arizona in the vicinity of the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation area. The one in the upper left that I took, at that point, the stream bed on the Mexican side was 5 feet higher than the stream bed on the U.S. side because so much debris had packed up against the wall, and then you'd had basically the sediment filling in that space. That causes a whole bunch of different problems. One problem is that as your stream bed rises, your wash spreads out, you get more erosion, that puts more debris into it, that packs it up deeper, and so you're basically just tearing up the landscape, causing all kinds of erosion, and also damming up the wall worse and worse and worse. An additional problem with that is that the wall, when you do that, you create a waterfall. So, the water in the next rain event is 5 feet higher or 6 feet higher on one side than it is on the other side. You get a waterfall going there that can gouge out the foundation for the border wall. And this is what happens when that occurs. Even though Customs and Border Protection said putting these walls across rivers and washes and other water courses won't be a problem. They have been. In 2011 and then again in 2014, you had instances where large sections of border wall were basically blown out by floodwaters. And you know, when we talk about floodwaters, these are regular events. You know, every August and then every December, you get significant rainfall in the desert. It just kind of dumps, and then you get these ephemeral washes that turn into flooding areas. Every 3 or 4 years, you get a situation where you get about the same rainfall as this, and that's basically what's occurred. In 2011, you get a chunk of the wall blown out. 2014, you get a chunk of the wall blown out. These 3 pictures were taken by the National Park Service in the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument in 2011. And in this case, you have a stream called Tejano Wash that is blocked off, and you can see when the photo was taken not too long after the event, there's no water in it. This is the wash right here. And this, you can kind of see these little structures down there. Those are floodgates. The Customs and Border Protection had already experienced flooding impacts in other places. They paid a contractor to check into it. The contractor said, we need to put floodgates every time the wall crosses a wash. They put them in, and then they forgot to open them, and then they got plugged up, and then the water basically traveled sideways along the wall until it got past the concrete footing in the wash, and then it blew out a chunk of border wall. So next. This problem doesn't just affect the environment, though. This is the city of Nogales. On the right side, you see Nogales, Mexico. On the left side, you see Nogales, Arizona. In the middle, kind of going diagonally across, you see the border wall. And there, the border wall is solid concrete, only in town. But town is basically in a low point, and it slopes from the Mexican side down to the US side. So you're basically got this one big drainage, all the water is coming into that. So in 2008, there's one of these nice, predictable, cyclical rain events. The water flows down. Normally it would just pass through into the United States. Instead, it hits a dam because that's basically, a dam is a wall that you stick in a river, and then you call it a lake behind it. They've created a lake that is only affecting the Mexican side. You can see the guy by the car on the US side. It looks like the water's about ankle deep for him. Here it's the top of doorways. An additional problem in this case was that there is right underneath that an underground drainage that goes from Mexico into the United States. It's like the same thing you see, the gutters on the streets. So all of that water is supposed to flow underneath. The Border Patrol said that people were using that tunnel to get into the United States, so they built a wall in it and a gate, and they didn't tell anybody. And that restricted the flow underneath. The roof of the tunnel heaved up. The roof of the tunnel is the street. The street heaves up, and so you have water flowing downhill and pouring up out of the ground, and then you get 6 feet of water on the Mexican side and just a few inches on the US side. That meant that you had 578 Mexican homes and businesses that were damaged or destroyed, 45 vehicles, and then once the water had receded, they found the bodies of 2 people who had drowned in that event. Next. Now, normally, that would be a problem. Normally, when you have a project that is doing, verifiable harm to federally endangered species, causing flooding impacts. The flooding that's going on in Mexico is basically a treaty violation because neither side is supposed to do anything that will harm the other side. That's part of the treaty that established the border in the first place. Normally, that would be an issue. However, in the past, in 2004 and then again in 2007, the Sierra Club joined with other environmental organizations. In 2004, we joined with Audubon Society and a number of organizations to sue to stop walls from being built in California. In 2007, the Sierra Club joined with Defenders of Wildlife and other environmental organizations to try to stop a section of wall that was going to be built in Arizona. And Congress didn't like the fact that the California lawsuit was slowing down wall construction, and so they passed the Real ID Act, and one portion of the Real ID Act of 2005 gives the Secretary of Homeland Security the authority to waive any, local, state, or federal law that is going to slow down construction of the border wall and the patrol road. He exercised that power to waive the laws that the California lawsuit was based upon. In the Arizona lawsuit, a judge actually granted a restraining order to say that this wall cannot be built, temporarily until Homeland Security complies with the National Environmental Policy Act. When that order came down, Secretary Chertoff, who was the Department of Homeland Security Secretary under President Bush, waived the laws in that area that were slowing it down, that basically the lawsuit had been based on. When the laws are knocked out, the lawsuit that's based on those laws is no longer valid, and border wall construction went ahead. Eventually, the Secretary waived 36 federal laws all along the U.S.-Mexico border for border wall construction, and this map actually shows kind of where walls were built. It's the kind of blue-green line that runs. At this point, not everything had been finished, so that's what the yellow and red bits are down in deep South Texas. So in 2009, those hadn't been finished yet, but it's the best map I've got. And essentially, in waiving those laws, and saying in the waiving document that by extension he was waiving all laws related to the subjects of those laws. So you waive the Clean Water Act and you waive all laws related to water. He was admitting that the wall was going to violate those laws, because why take on the bad press of waiving laws that you're not actually going to be in violation of? It's important to note that nobody else can do this. The President of the United States can't waive laws like this. This waiver authority only applies to the Secretary of Homeland Security, who's not elected. If the President doesn't like it, the President would have to fire the Secretary and appoint a new Secretary who'd already promised to not do that or to rescind those. But it's entirely up to the Secretary's discretion, and nobody else has any statutory authority to counter that or to question that. It's only for border walls. There is no other instance in which the Secretary or anybody else would be authorized to waive these laws. If there were a terrorist attack, if they want to build border walls, that's the only response that would allow for the waiver of laws. So we're basically saying that this is the most important thing ever, and that no other laws that exist out there are as important as these border walls. So the next one. And a number of people have pointed out kind of the extremity of this. We're basically privileging border walls over all else, and privileging this sort of border enforcement over everything else that we could possibly be doing. And it's important to note that the waiver doesn't just cover environmental laws, and the waivers that were issued didn't just cover environmental laws. You also had the Antiquities Act that protects things like historic structures or ruin sites, things like that. You have the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which kind of, as you would assume, protects the graves of Native American nations. You have the Farmland Policy Protection Act, which basically just protects farmland. These are not environmental laws. There's no restriction on this waiving authority. And, again, that sets up this issue where border walls are more important than anything else. it also sets a precedent, because if you can waive, you know, any and all laws for this project because you say this project is so terribly important, you can do that for anything. You know, Congress now has established this precedent. So if Congress wants to say, we have this other terribly destructive project that people don't like, let's give somebody else a waiver, let's waive all the laws for that. That precedent's in play, so it can keep going. And, you know, in the case of the border wall, it's also important to kind of realize just how extreme this has gotten, and the fact that it really does impact people's lives. It's not just, you know, cute fuzzy animals, although it's kind of sad for the cute fuzzy animals. It's also people. You know, this is a home in Brownsville. It's about an hour away from my house, where people, you know, every day when the sun goes down, the border wall casts a shadow on their house. There are a number of houses like this. There's a whole neighborhood. If you go to Nogales, Arizona, it's the same basic thing. There are houses that are close enough to the border and to the border wall that the wall casts a shadow on those houses. And the abilities of the Border Patrol to do these sorts of enforcement actions and of Customs and Border Protection, both of those fall under the Department of Homeland Security, don't just extend to places like this that are right there next to the border, although in this case the wall is probably a half-mile away from the actual border. Because what the Homeland Security has established what they call the functional equivalent of the border. That's their actual term for it. And so 100 miles from the actual border, so either the line that runs from El Paso to the Pacific or going the other direction follows the Rio Grande down. Within 100 miles of that, you're in the functional equivalent of the border. And, you know, like Philadelphia is 100 miles from here. Hartford, Connecticut's 100 miles from here. They would probably not appreciate being called the functional equivalent of New York. And anybody living in that 100-mile zone or living, or any ecosystem within that 100-mile zone is subject to different rules from the whole rest of the country. Within that area, the Border Patrol can search your private property. So they can enter, my house is 10 miles from the border. They can come into my backyard. They don't need to have a warrant. They don't need to have probable cause. They want to pull me over and search my car. No warrant, no probable cause necessary. Nothing I can do about it. They have set up checkpoints like the one on the painting there that lead out from all of the border cities in Texas. That checkpoint is about, the 77 is actually accurate both for the highway and for the distance. It's about 70 miles from the actual border. Police can't do that. That's already been struck down by courts for police. The rules that were recently put in place by the Obama administration regarding racial profiling, Border Patrol got a specific exemption because they said they couldn't do their job if they couldn't racially profile. Their use of force, including the use of deadly force, they have much, much laxer rules than regular municipal police, even though they're operating in towns and cities along the border. And of course, then they can waive laws, as I said before. And this is why the ACLU has referred to this area as basically a constitution-free zone, because the rules that apply to everybody else don't apply within the functional equivalent of the border. Is that good? And this one can show what that can mean on a practical basis. This picture was taken by my daughter a couple of years ago. And so Krista Schleier, who was the photographer who was in the video a second ago, came down to the Rio Grande Valley. We got in the car and headed over to one of the sections of the wildlife refuge that is between the wall and the river. And we went down a dirt road back there. came upon Border Patrol and stopped and said hi. And he came over, checked out our car, chatted for a minute, saw my 7-year-old daughter in her little pink car seat in the back of the Subaru, and called for backup. And we then had 2 more Border Patrol SUVs, so there was his in front, another one in the back, one on the side, and we had Border Patrol agents, including a couple like that guy who had machine guns, in front of and behind our car. And they walked around taking pictures of us with an iPad for a half hour, but they were concerned about her privacy. They always had her hide her face under a hat if they were going to take a picture. And then after about a half hour, they let us go because we weren't breaking any laws. But, you know, that would be an issue if a regular cop did that. This is not terribly uncommon. One of the problems is that the Border Patrol, in my area at least, aren't very well trained, and they don't know what their rules of engagement are. So different Border Patrol agents will tell you very different things about where you are. This guy was convinced I was on private property, even though that would be the sheriff's business and not his business, even though I wasn't. And they don't know what their own rules of engagement are. And so that is a real problem because there's not really, like internal affairs kind of a thing, there's none of that. There's no ability to really complain and feel like you're going to get anywhere. Okay. And you know, even with the border walls, even with this tremendous paramilitary presence, even with waived laws, people still come across. You know, fundamentally, walls don't work. You know, former DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano once famously said that, you know, show me a 50-foot wall and I'll show you a 51-foot ladder. In Reynosa, Mexico, there is some little shop that just bangs these things out. And they are, you know, when somebody uses one, because you can actually kind of see Reynosa through the bars of the wall in the background. It's right there. There's a building. I know it's there at least. And, you know, these things get piled up against the wall, because of course once you've climbed over you're not going to go back for your ladder. Border Patrol doesn't like to have that sitting there waiting for the next person, so they drag them and make a big stack of them. Every couple of weeks the county comes by, hauls them off to the dump, and then it starts all over again. I took this picture in 2012. I took that picture in 2014 or 15. I was back out there a couple of weeks ago, and there's another pile. It never stops, and they all look about the same too. I mean, I really do think there is some little shop that's making a good business off of this. But you know, you're talking basically a ladder that's $5 worth of lumber. That wall that the ladder is propped up against costs $12 million a mile. And even the gold standard, this is the wall that separates Tijuana from San Diego, and you can kind of see the red in the foreground. That's the old landing mat wall, and then you got the second wall behind it. Even those walls don't work. You know, the Border Patrol knows this. The Border Patrol has a couple of times been quoted in the press referring to the border wall as a speed bump in the desert, and that's pretty accurate. You know, and they'll even say, Border Patrol has never said border walls will stop anybody. They're making these walls because politicians tell them to. Border Patrol says, yeah, this will slow somebody down by a few minutes, and that's it. And that's all it will do. But we've spent on that speed bump approximately $3 billion so far, you know, in terms of construction and maintenance. It's hard to get a very solid number, but it's somewhere between $2 billion and $3 billion. I would suspect closer to the $3 billion mark. But we've spent that money on something that just doesn't work. The reason that we as a nation keep doing that is because they're great photo ops. You know, if you are a politician and you want to make a campaign ad, you stand in front of a border wall, you've got a nice backdrop. You can say, look, I'm doing something, I'm saving you. As long as somebody doesn't climb over while you're doing that, I guess you can edit that out. Next one. The problem is that the one real solid effect that walls do have on people coming across is that they move traffic. So somebody comes up to an area, they see a very visible enforcement, they see the wall, they see the Border Patrol that are parked alongside it, and so they move for a place that looks less heavily patrolled. Those places are very often in desert areas. So in this case, that's a migrant trail through Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. That's brutal desert. As soon as the walls went up in San Diego and they started seeing people moving further to the east into Arizona, the number of deaths of migrants just skyrocketed. I mean, it was a huge and very immediate change. And it's because, if you were crossing directly between Tijuana and San Diego, it's going to take you maybe 10, 15 minutes to get to a bus stop or to, find a ride somewhere further into the interior. If you're doing that at Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, it could take you a week. And, this past Saturday, it hit 111 degrees Fahrenheit in Tucson. A gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. So if you imagine how much water it would take you to survive a week-long trek through the desert when it's hitting 111 degrees in the middle of the day, you can't carry that much water. And so people die, hundreds of people die every year. In Arizona, also in Texas, although in Texas it's going around the checkpoints because people have no problem getting over the wall. But the checkpoints are a bigger obstacle, and people trying to go around those end up dying in the same way that they die in Arizona. The Colibri Center, which is an organization that has been trying to identify the remains of people who have died and get the remains repatriated and returned to their families, has estimated that more than 6,330 men, women, and children have died crossing the U.S.-Mexico border since 1998. The next one. And in kind of normal situations, we would think of that as a national tragedy. When you have thousands of people dying, when you have tremendous environmental damage being done, we would see this as a national tragedy, and people would mobilize to stop it. And the problem is that instead of that being the case, border walls tend to be an applause line in a politician's speech. There's not an understanding of the reality of them. There is this mythical idea that they do what they're supposed to do, but they don't. And this is where it gets kind of frustrating because there is such a wide chasm between sort of the popular idea of what a border wall is and does and the on-the-ground reality of it. And really the way to stop new walls, if that were to happen, or to stop new waivers from being enacted, or to even more wonderfully tear the walls that exist down, would be just to make them unpopular, because they're being built not for any tactical reason, because they don't work. They're being built for political reasons. And as soon as there is no political reason to build them, as soon as politicians who would be pushing that legislation look and say, oh, wait, this isn't going to get me any votes, they'll stop building them. There's no need to build them anymore. And people that live along the border have been trying to get that to happen for quite some time, actually. These are two art installations that were done on the border wall near Tijuana. And, again, Tijuana is right on the coast. It's right by south of San Diego. You can do this stuff on the on the Arizona and California walls. You can't do this on the Texas wall, because in the Texas wall, the wall is like a half-mile away from the border, so Border Patrol gets on both sides. There, the Border Patrol's got no jurisdiction, so like where that ladder is stuck on the ground, that's Mexico. The wall itself is about 3 feet in, but there's just not enough room for the Border Patrol to move, because you can just kind of hop and then you're out of their jurisdiction again. So you get work like this that is intended to basically redefine the wall, to turn it from something that in the popular imagination is all about security and safety and protection, and to turn it into what it really is, which is a cause of tremendous deaths. On the coffins that are bolted to the wall, to the landing mat wall on the picture that's towards the right, those have the number of bodies recovered per year. And so you can see like, this farthest one is 2004, and it's 337 bodies, or sorry, 373 bodies. And, it's trying to get across that idea of what the wall really does, as opposed to what the idea of the wall is supposed to do. Next one. And this is something that, people have been trying to do. Yeah, it's still there too. This is something that people in the border region have been trying to do for quite some time. This sign was put up in a field. I think it had sorghum at the time, but they rotate all kinds of things into that field. Before the walls went up, it was put up by Pamela Taylor, who has a house just out of the picture off to the right. There are, I think, 3 or 4 houses in this area. The tree line is essentially where the river is. There's a couple houses tucked back in there. Those houses in that field were going to be behind the wall, because in Texas, we can't build the wall against the river, because then the river floods and the water would bounce into Mexico, and the flooding would be worse for them. And potentially you could change where the border is, because the river is the border, and if the river bounces south and then settles, we just gained a whole bunch of territory, and that's not cool by the treaty. And so these people, if they felt like a wall was going to be of any use, if they felt like they were in some sort of a war zone, and they needed protection, and the wall was going to do that, they would be begging for a wall. And instead, people all along the border, very consistently are opposed to these walls, because it's not a war zone. I mean, San Diego and El Paso are frequently rated as 2 of the safest cities in the United States by the FBI. McAllen, where I live, is just downright boring. So we're not in a war zone. It's not horrible spillover violence crime, and walls don't do anything. The people that put that sign up, they've been maintaining it ever since, and they're now behind the border wall. They have to pass through it every time they want to get to the grocery store, to anything else. So, next. And then this is what we try to address with the Borderlands team. So, as I said kind of at the beginning, the Borderlands team is kind of a subgroup within the Sierra Club focused on border walls. And our goal is to basically educate people throughout the United States about the impacts of the wall. Because people that live down here, we can kind of see them, but if you don't, you don't know. And so we do a lot of outreach. We do guided tours out to the wall. I'm not sure when I think the top left one, that's Dan Millis. He's a Borderlands organizer and out of Tucson taking a school field trip. I think that was last year. The one below was from last December. That's the the Santa Cruz River. So that one aerial shot that we saw, that's it. That's right where the river was crossed by crossing the border. That's where that picture is at ground level. And we took a large group out there so they could see the wall firsthand and also see what happens when you stick a wall like that across a river like the Santa Cruz. The one on the lower right is an anti-wall march that went up that we were part of in South Texas before the wall went up. And then the very dramatic picture up on the upper right is a group of our Borderlands team members lobbying Congress last year, and actually that's on the left with the backpack on is Krista Schleier, who we saw in the video at the beginning. And you know, what it comes down to in all this is the fact that the legislation to build border walls and the legislation to waive laws on the border and to, you know, double and double again the size of the Border Patrol, all this stuff originates in Washington, D.C. You don't have border legislators saying, we want this. You have people from other parts of the country saying, do that down there. I think part of it is because, you know, it's never going to have a negative impact on their constituents, so they're not going to have to face any backlash for it. And so because of that, and because federal legislation is always voted on by all members of all 50 states, or by delegations from all 50 states, we have to kind of do stuff like this and get the word out and let people know in more places that, you know, the reality is very different from how these things are presented. Last slide. And that's Dan Millis again. When we were visiting the Otay Mountain Wilderness area with a Border Patrol escort, and so they're bemusedly watching him demonstrate how easy it is to climb the border wall. They were cool. They were you know, more friendly Border Patrol agents because they had to do a ride along with us all day long. So, you know, I would encourage you to keep up with this. You know, you can go to our website. You know, we're on Twitter, of course, on Facebook. You have to be on all the social media stuff or you don't exist. If you're even that much more interested, you can certainly join our Borderlands team. That email address is for that guy on the wall right there. Mine was at the beginning. I can give you that too. But he's actually paid by the Sierra Club. I'm just a volunteer, so I'm a lot less official. And then we also have a listserv, so if you're interested in the listserv and you want to get sporadic emails, you can sign up for that. And probably the most important thing, even though I'm supposed to stay away from politics as much as possible, is like make sure that you tell your friends and especially tell your members of Congress that you don't want to see more border walls being built. Like that right there is the most important thing, because when our members have gone and done lobbying in DC and they go to congressional offices, when you get a congressional office that is not a border state, so many of them say, A, I didn't know anything about this, and then B, you're the first person that's talked to me about this issue. So, you know, even a small number of calls or letters or emails saying, hey, border walls are a tremendous waste of money, they're tremendously destructive, don't do that anymore. That can actually make a difference, because they'll be like, well, they've only, you know, all of the 5 emails that we got on this topic were all saying border walls are bad. Obviously, it's not going to get us any more votes if we build more. Why should we vote in favor of more walls? And every single election cycle, members of Congress have an opportunity to vote. There are a couple of bills in the House right now that would build more border walls. They come around and come around because, you know, they always want to be able to say, we did something, we saved you. And if you want stickers, I got a bunch of stickers too. We have both English and Spanish. You guys can pay $1 or I'll give them to you for free, it doesn't matter. It's not a huge crowd here, so I can afford to be generous. And that's essentially it. If you've got any questions, I'd be happy to answer. I could probably talk about the show a bunch too, because I did the thing in the back, and I know the artist who did that. She's a friend of mine, and I know about the metal pieces that are. I don't know the artist who made them, but I know what their original context was. They or something just like them was at one time bolted to the border wall in Nogales. So, cool. And if you want to ask specific political questions, I have to like turn off the mic because otherwise then I'm talking for the Sierra Club. Yeah.
I was actually wondering if you spoke much with border agents, and if so, how they think about the border wall. Are they generally in support of it, or do they say, hey, this is actually silly? Or?
So I think there's sort of two levels on that. I go out to the border wall all the time. When reporters come down to South Texas and they want to write a story about the wall, I'll take them out because it's only about a 10-minute, 15-minute drive from my house to get to the wall. And then, so there's agents, they'll be parked in their trucks. They generally just kind of go, pfft, when you talk about the border wall. So the picture in there that I took, that's the big tall picture, it's got the footprints going up the wall. Somebody had apparently realized that soccer cleats are not good for traction, and so they kicked them off and the cleats were still in the grass, and then they got those nice bare footprints up there. There was a Border Patrol agent sitting right there while I was taking the picture. And I was like, what's up with that? These footprints are beautiful. He's like, yeah, that happens all the time. And so they don't take the wall very seriously. They don't, the agents on the ground, they are very nervous about ever being quoted, because I've had reporters out with me and they're like, I don't want to talk to you. This is not going to be good for my career to say anything one way or the other. Go talk to the people whose job it is. And then when you talk to those guys, they have to be on message. So individual agents that I've talked to, they are all pretty dismissive of the wall. They may be very gung-ho about what their job is. Some of them just see it as a job, but some of them are very gung-ho about sort of the ideology behind it. But I've never had one that says this thing is great and it's doing wonderful things for us.
So fairly reticent to criticize it outright.
They sure don't want to be quoted. That's not good for their job. They want to stay employed. Sure.
Picking up from that, I was also wondering when you were speaking about how poorly trained or poorly informed of the laws that they cannot enforce in terms of border agents. I was wondering if there's also a lot of turnover, or if it's just like something that sort of ignorance kind of just sticks with the career-minded. I'm
not entirely sure about the turnover, but they did have a huge surge in hiring. So beginning around 2005, 2006, the same time as the border walls were all called for, the Border Patrol doubled in size, and they were told to double really fast. And there have been a lot of issues with the standards that they would previously they said you have to meet these requirements to get in. They had to relax those to get the numbers that they needed to get. They used to polygraph everybody, and then they didn't have time to polygraph everybody, and so now they're having all kinds of fun instances where they're finding people who actually were working for cartels. I'm sure it's not the majority or anything, but it would have been good to polygraph everybody first. And I think it's more like they rushed the training when they hired new guys. And so they will, and they also move them around quite a bit too. When Tucson sector, so basically most of southern Arizona used to be where they had the most crossings, and so they just had a massive deployment of Border Patrol there. When you started seeing a lot of these refugee families coming through Texas, they basically look at a map and they're like, South Texas is closest, so they go straight for that. They're coming up from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. At that point, the location of the highest number of crossings changed, so they just moved a whole bunch of agents. And so, I think that especially plays into the agents not knowing that they're standing in a wildlife refuge and thinking that they're on private property. I had one agent who was an older man who had been in local law enforcement, and I was talking to him while I was out at the wall, and he just went off on a tear about the other agents because he's like, they don't know the rules, they don't know anything, they think they're so tough. And so he apparently thought that, that they did not really understand the rules of engagement they were supposed to be operating under. But I don't know actually what their training is. I just noticed that I get very different stories from different agents, and they'll say very different things about what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do and who's allowed to be where, and they're just not consistent. And if they had decent training, I would expect, even if the training was wrong or whatever, at least it would be consistent. Yeah?
Have there ever been any plans by government or nonprofits that aren't a wall that were a different way to manage the border?
No, not really. I mean, I think, so the border walls that we have now really got going with the Secure Fence Act's passage. And those walls were initially part of two competing bills that were big comprehensive immigration reform bills in the House and Senate. And they had all this other stuff and pathways to citizenship and work visas and all this other kind of stuff in their different bills. The House and Senate could never agree. Like, they each passed their own bill, but they couldn't come together and figure out, okay, here's the bill that's going to go to the president. And because they couldn't work that out, they just pulled the border walls out, and they passed that as a standalone. And nothing is, I mean, the only other thing that they ever talk about is boots on the ground, which is more agents. The walls, or I guess, as we've been hearing in the campaign now, bigger walls and more walls, but it's always, walls and agents, that's the only thing. The Border Patrol and even the upper levels of the Border Patrol have repeatedly said the thing that would be helpful, they're like, walls are fine, especially if you stick them in a city. That's the thing they always say, is like, you put them in a town where it takes no time at all to get from, like, say, Matamoros to Brownsville. They're both butting up against the river. So you slow somebody down by a minute and a half, and that gives the agent an extra minute and a half to catch up with them. But they always say, if we just had some kind of immigration reform, that would take the pressure off, because then all the people who just want to come and work could take a normal pathway. And right now, it can take years and possibly decades, depending on what country you're coming from, to get legal status to come to the United States. Like, if we could allow for people to do that, then the only people that are coming through are the bad guys, it's the smugglers. And so then Border Patrol has frequently said that would actually be very helpful for them.
The ridiculous amount of power that Homeland Security was given, was that initial, or was that something that they kind of threw in later?
So, Homeland Security was created, what year was it, 2002 or 3, I can't remember, and basically as a giant umbrella organization, and they've got the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection and FEMA and the Coast Guard and all these other agencies that are sort of under their big giant umbrella. The power to waive laws was in the Real ID Act of 2005, which failed as a standalone bill, was stuck in as an attachment to tsunami relief and funding for Iraq and Afghanistan, and because you can't vote against that. And so it passed when it got in that bill. And it, the name of it, the Real ID Act, is because that bill was supposed to be all about having verifiable ID cards, so that, and the idea with immigration was that way you can tell if somebody is supposed to be in the United States or not, and then if they're applying for a job, for sure if they are legally entitled to work in the U.S. or not. And then they just kind of tucked in Section 102, which gives the waiver authority, which was explicitly because they were having trouble getting the walls finished in California. When the Secure Fence Act was passed the next year, that pre-existing authority applied to these new walls. And so, depending on how they write the legislation, any further walls that they would do, including walls on the U.S.-Canada border, if they build border walls on the U.S.-Canada border, which is not going to happen because, we're not scared of Canadians, if they did that, they could waive laws for that as well. But that's ridiculous. Politically, that's ridiculous. Yeah.
So the lawsuits that you mentioned about the Sierra Club and I guess was Audubon as well, yeah. Did they ever come to a verdict, or did the Real ID Act get passed before they?
So the first one was like Sierra Club and Audubon. It was in 2004. It didn't get like a ruling on it. And then they tried to appeal when the Real ID Act was used to wipe that out. But the judge just said, no, the Real ID Act is here, so tough. In the 2007 one, which was Sierra Club and Defenders of Wildlife, they did get a temporary restraining order, and so wall construction had to stop. And then a few days later, you get a waiver that was explicitly to knock that lawsuit out of the water, and it did. And so in that case, they tried to appeal to the Supreme Court, but the Real ID Act is written so you can't appeal to anything but the Supreme Court, so the whole appeals court is cut out of the process, and you can only appeal based on constitutional grounds. So the Supreme Court just they didn't rule one or the other, they just didn't take it up. So that let the lower court ruling stand that had knocked their lawsuit out.
And that was in Arizona or in California?
In Arizona. So the first one was California, the second one was Arizona.
I just have another quick question about
Sure.
the Border Patrol people. Do they tend to be people who live within the exact region? Because you were mentioning before how it's fairly unanimous that people who live along the border wall oppose it, right?
Yes, but it's all, I mean, well, so yeah, you get a mix. There are people that come from other parts of the country. They are usually less fun to talk to. But there are a lot of locals, especially where I live, because this is an area that is, you've got 2 of the 10 poorest counties in the United States right there. Border Patrol is a good paying job. And so they will, they'll join the Border Patrol, and they are usually a lot more realistic about the threat and everything else that they face. They're much more casual when you talk to them because they've grown up there. They know the place. But there's, like I say, there's a mix. And I don't know the exact numbers, but the ones I encounter, it's probably about half and half. I mean, I don't know how that filters in when you talk about the whole structure, but. Yeah. I actually had a talk with one in Nogales last December. The best talks are when they're really bored because they have to sit there in their truck just staring at the wall all day long, and nobody's going to climb right there because they can see the truck. And he said that his parents were undocumented, and they came across into San Diego, and then were amnestied under President Reagan. There was Reagan signed a bill in, I think it was '86. That part of the bill was amnestying people who had been in the United States, and so his parents got U.S. citizenship. And then when he joined the Border Patrol, he said that he's got some members of his family that are very proud of him because he's got a good paying job and it's very respectable. He's got other members of his family, especially ones that live in Tijuana, that call him a traitor. And so I think that there's, Celeste's husband works for, it's either ICE or Border Patrol. I can't remember which. So, yeah, it's more complicated. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Sure, thanks.